You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHEX.
Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode of Supply Chain Secrets. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is the logistics legend, Lars Jensen.
Hi everyone.
We've got a live audience today, and we are excited to talk about the hot topic of the week, which is what to expect at TPM. I think most listeners in the logistics industry are probably aware of this conference that happens annually, but for those of you who are wondering what TPM is, it is a very large conference for participants in the global ocean container shipping supply chains, and they focus primarily on the Transpac trade. If you aren't able to go, well, you're in luck, because if you go to the About page for TPM25, Lars is the first guest speaker listed, and I'm sure it's listed in order of importance, so you listeners are getting the inside scoop by being part of the pod. So, Lars, let's get into it. For importers and NVOs attending TPM, what is top of mind for those in that process?
I think top of mind, the question everybody wants an answer to, and spoiler alert, they can't get an answer to, what will the market do? What is the right contract to make right now? The problem is there is going to be a lot of questions over at TPM. There's going to be a lot of suggested scenarios on how the year will play out. There's not going to be a definitive answer. And that simply boils down to the uncertainty we have in the market. So maybe one way to phrase it the other way around is, what should you spend your time on if you show up over at TPM? And from my perspective, I think the time is well spent on asking questions. Doesn't matter whether you're over there as a cargo owner or a shipping line or a freight forwarder or any of the other main stakeholders in the supply chain. Ask all the other stakeholders, what are they seeing? What are they preparing? Because the honest truth is there's a lot of very, very different scenarios that could play out this year. And it's a matter of being prepared for all of them. You, of course, have to at one point say, well, given all these uncertainties, what do I believe is the right way forward, especially in terms of a contract? But the more you talk to all the other stakeholders, the more you know how are they thinking about this. What are their plans B, C, and D? The better you are prepared to then handle whatever the market is going to throw at us this year.
Do you think that the uncertainty for this year is anything different than previous years?
Fundamentally, yes. I mean, when you go to TPM, I think this is my 13th TPM I'm going to, there's always uncertainty. There's always a number of different scenarios that could play out in the year ahead. That's just the nature of it. I mean, this is business, this is shipping, things change. So of course you can never get a picture perfect forecast. But I think the mist of uncertainty this time is a lot higher. And that has less to do with the container shipping sector and more to do with the geopolitical challenges that we have also been discussing in the last couple of podcasts here. That simply adds an added layer to the uncertainty. You can say we're used to uncertainties. We don't know exactly what the carriers will do, what the shippers will do, what the consumers will do. But add to this the uncertainty, what will the politicians do? And for those that would already now raise their hands and say, hang on, we never know what the politicians are going to do. That's a fair argument, but I cannot recall a point in time where the distance between the politicians saying something and actually implementing that in practical terms and policy, that time span is so immensely short. Just one of the most recent examples, from mentioning what the tariffs should be on Mexico and Canada until that was implemented was 2 or 3 days. Then the time span for putting them on hold, that time span was 1 day. That's simply an added level of uncertainty we haven't had to deal with before.
Yeah, I think your advice is really good in terms of make sure that you're having conversations with your different carrier providers and understand how they're thinking about things, because with all of the turmoil going on and all the disruptions, you need to understand where other people are at and make sure that you can meet them there in order to make sure that your contracts are set up for success in this upcoming year.
And maybe an additional element, this is not just about contracts. If we look over just the last 5 years, there's been no shortage of curveballs with the pandemic and ships getting stuck in Suez and the Red Sea crisis and what have you. And yet, despite all these curveballs, the supply chains continue to function. Sure, they were more expensive, they took longer times, there were more delays than people would have liked, but they continue to function. And one of the key reasons they continue to function is that, pardon my French, but in this industry, when the shit hits the fan, what solves is typically people talking to people in the various parts of the supply chain. And one of the absolutely important elements and one of the values of, for example, going to TPM is the sheer number of people that makes things happen that occur there. This is where relationships are either forged or maintained. This is where you have a chat with the people you want to reach out to when suddenly the supply chain seems to go off the rails and you need a plan B implemented rapidly. So yes, we can make a whole podcast about digitalization and what will AI do, and it can do a lot. But at the end of the day, when these sudden changes happen, it all boils down to who do I have a relation to that I can call and make things happen rapidly.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's definitely a people-driven industry. And I think even for folks that aren't able to attend TPM, you still can do these steps and reach out to your different carrier providers and make sure that you are scheduling meetings with them or maybe going to visit them in person. TPM just makes it a little bit easier because everyone's in the same spot at the same time. Lars, what do you think importers and NVOs are focusing on this year? Do you think it's more rate or capacity? What are your thoughts there?
Offhand, I would think the main focus is rate. I think everybody is secretly hoping for the rates to collapse following a Red Sea reopening. It's not going to be as simple as that, but I think deep down that's what a lot of them are hoping for. And I think a lot of them are coming into contract negotiations also from the perspective that if the Red Sea reopens, you are going to look at adjustments that could move rates down rapidly. And that's, of course, from the shipper side. And there are a couple of things that shippers could certainly contemplate. The easier one would be to go down the path of putting in contingencies. What will the rate do in the contract if, for example, the Red Sea reopens? That's a pretty clear trigger point that you might want to put in. Or put in and say, fine, the base rate is actually assuming the Red Sea is open, then there might be a surcharge in place as long as that happens. But the other guardrail to put in is to try to pursue and talk to some of the stakeholders. I know there are multiple stakeholders also at TPM talking about the index-linked rates. That again leads us down a path where if you're pursuing index-linked contracts, what is your key objective here? Is your key objective to have exactly the same rate throughout the year? No, an index-linked contract won't give you that, but it's illusory to think your normal contracts would do that as well. But on the other hand, going down that path, you might have a higher degree of certainty in terms of your actual access to space if something untoward should happen. And I know right now we are talking about contingencies in terms of what if the rates drop, and I can certainly understand importers not wanting to miss the boat if the rates suddenly drop sharply later in the year. Absolutely perfectly fair. But I would just keep in the back of my mind, think of the curveballs we had, first with the pandemic, then with the Red Sea crisis, how rapidly things can suddenly move in the other direction. I can't say what would that potential curveball be in 25 that would lead us down that path, but I can say we have an enormous amount of geopolitical uncertainty ongoing right now. And where that will lead us is entirely unknown. It could turn out to lead us nowhere in terms of disrupting the container shipping markets, or it could prove out to be the third strike in terms of suddenly not having enough capacity.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of deciding for yourself and for your company what your appetite for risk is. You know, if you're wanting to secure that space long term, you probably want to lean more into the long term contracts. And then if you're wondering about, you know, how the rates might fluctuate, a decent option might be doing an index linked contract to help safeguard from dramatic fluctuations, and you can kind of be in tune with what's happening in the market.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned the correct word. What is your risk appetite? There is no risk-free option here. That simply doesn't exist. I think everybody has learned that the hard way over the last 5 years. Even signing a fixed 1 year contract with fixed rates and fixed allocations, as we've seen over the 5 years, that is also not a risk-free option.
Yeah. Do you have any other practical advice? Like, what are some types of negotiating tactics that shippers and NVOs can use, or maybe even just things that they should be thinking about as they're designing these contracts for the upcoming season?
I think some of the things to really contemplate when you're designing these ones is, again, boiling down to your risk appetite. What can you live with? What is the actual risk in here? Going down the path of figuring out, I might think I'm going to move 90% of my cargo on a specific corridor. How much do I really want to battle over the last few months? How am I going to handle a situation where suddenly my supply chain needs to change? Because we tend to focus on the carriers, but let's just take the importers as an example. You might right now be importing from, let's say, Vietnam into the US. But will you also be doing that 52 weeks from now if Vietnam is suddenly slapped with a 20% import tariff and neighboring Cambodia is not, as an example? I think as a shipper, you need to go into this also prepared from the option that you might be in a situation where you cannot uphold your end at the bargain. So how do you build in some flexibility in these contracts?
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points. Lars, we got a funny comment from an audience member saying that you shouldn't be filming in the car. You should actually film next time out of an ocean vessel. So maybe we can make that happen for future episodes. I did want to ask you a bit about the new alliances and how that might be impacting how people are thinking about their contracts.
Yeah, you can say what a lot of shippers have been doing and have been doing for I was about to say untold years is typically very, very few importers want to, or exporters want to put all their eggs in one basket. So you want to spread risk. And usually the thought process there is you want to spread the risk to 2 or 3 different alliances. That has been what has been going on the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I'm pretty sure that that game will be the same this time around. Now, of course, as a shipper, up until you can say last year, if you wanted to spread your risk wide, you would have a contract with a carrier in each of the 3 alliances. What you're going to ask yourself now is, do you want to split that in 4? I mean, sure, MSC is standalone, but I tend to call them an alliance anyhow, so we really got 4 alliances this time around. Do you want to split it in 4? And if not, then it's time to choose who do you actually want to align yourself with. Given the changes in some of the alliances, some shippers are probably also in the situation where they tended to split their risk. One example could be you had a contract both with Maersk and with Hapag-Lloyd that gave you exposure to both 2M and the THE alliance. Now what? Do you want to keep yourself exposed to both of those 2 carriers, but that's just one alliance? Or do you want to reduce the overall exposure you have to those 2 carriers and find a new one in one of the other alliances? Those are also questions the individual shippers need to come to grips with.
Yeah, and I think as the alliance settles and they, see how it's actually working out in terms of how their services are set up, you might start to see changes. And for that reason, maybe diversifying is helpful for you, just to prevent any risk of like maybe your primary lane or your primary service might end up being cut because it's not a primary service for a lot of other folks.
Yeah, you can say, I mean, I'm sure all the carriers, they have done their homework in designing the services we are seeing now. They're prepared well, they're phasing them in. But I mean, there's this old adage that no plan ever survives the first day of battle, so to speak. And it's probably going to be the same with all the new services the carriers are launching here. Once you start to see booking uptake, once you see where the cargo flows, that is not going to lead to a massive change in networks, but it can lead to minor adjustments. It can lead to changes. A practical one we saw just a couple of days ago was a change in Gemini in terms of something as simple as the sequence of ports they called in the US East Coast on one of their services. Swapping the sequence. Of course, it's a minor change, but if you are the ones using that one, that means neither you either now get a slightly faster or a slightly slower transit time. And all shippers should expect a lot of these changes to happen over the coming months as we settle into the new networks.
Do you have any perspective on when importers are thinking about splitting their volume between working directly with ocean carriers and working with NVOs or freight forwarders. Like, do you have any advice there or perspective that you want to provide to help these importers make decisions on that type of spread?
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a right and wrong answer to that one. Again, it depends on what is it you want as a shipper. The first thing to, of course, keep in mind is if you want to have the relations directly with the carriers, that is absolutely possible, but it requires something more of you as a shipper in terms of what are the qualifications, what are the skill level you have internally to deal directly with the carriers. I'm not saying it's rocket science, but it does require some skill level. Where in other cases, what I see is that skill level might not be there. That could be voluntary, it could be involuntary, and that to some degree then tends to be outsourced to some of the third-party providers. That is one of the thought processes that goes into how do you split that. Another one of the thought processes, you have some shippers that do a combination. They have a lot of their cargo stitched up in contracts with a few mainline operators directly, but they're also having relations with one or more NVOs from the perspective that if something in the market really goes wrong, those NVOs might be able to have access to space that you wouldn't necessarily have with the MLOs you usually tend to work with. Or I might have my good contracts, let's say on Trans-Pacific, but suddenly, for whatever reason, I need to import 4 containers from South Africa. Should I then go out and find a mainline operator, or do I have a third-party provider that I tend to work with for these ad hoc requests? So you tend to sometimes see a very broad span here in terms of it's not an either or.
Yeah, those are all good points. I think also something that you have to think about is the price of it. And I'm sure that's top of mind already for everyone anyway, but do you want to pay that additional charge to have someone else handle the freight? It might be easier for you if you're a smaller team and you need help in some of those regions that are a bit more difficult to reach, or maybe you're not moving as much volume out of those areas of the world.
Yeah, but you can say this is where this industry becomes fascinating because it goes in both directions. You also find times, typically when the market is nosediving rapidly, where you as a shipper at times can find deals on third-party providers that are lower than the mainline operators. That might offhand sound a bit odd because they are loading on the mainline operators, but some of them simply say, well, this cargo is not going to move until 3 or 4 weeks into the future, so we're just assuming rates are going down, rates will be lower, and sometimes they will simply offer you a lower rate in the expectation that the MLO rate is going to go down. But sometimes you also see the opposite. If you think back to the period during the pandemic, where we were suddenly talking $15,000, $20,000 freight rates.
Yeah, true. We do have a question from an audience member here. So a traditional TPM used to be 4 days, and the market was set. BCO contracts were signed right after, and then NVO would follow. Do you believe that this year we will see a delay in signing long-term contracts?
We could potentially, I would at least expect to see quite a bit of hesitation because of all the uncertainty we have out there. If we look at the changes in the market just over the past 4 or 5 weeks, God knows what changes we'll see from now and until the usual contracts start on May 1st. So I would expect at least a lot of hesitation in terms of committing as the market looks right now.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing as well. But I think you also, as an importer, you need to keep in mind that it does take some time for the carriers to get your contract set up, the allocation established in their system. So you don't want to wait until the final moment because you might have some trouble actually getting booked.
It basically goes back to what we talked about before. What's your risk appetite?
Right. All right. I think that is all the questions that we have. This was a really good episode. Thanks, Lars, for all of the input. For those of you that are attending TPM next week, we're going to be doing a live podcast session at the NYSHEX booth. We will have a booth outside located between the Hyatt Regency and the Convention Center. So stop by on Monday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, and you'll see me, Lars, and maybe some other surprise guests, who knows. And we'll just be talking about what we've seen for day one, what we're expecting for day two. You can stop by and watch and engage with us, ask questions, meet other fans of the podcast. So it'll be an exciting event for us. But as always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thanks for the live audience members that joined today. Feel free to join for future episodes if you didn't get a chance today. If you head to NYSHEX.com/podcast, that's NYSHEX.com/podcast, you can register for future episodes. But with all that being said, thank you for joining, and I hope you have an awesome week.
Hope to see a lot of you over at TPM.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NYSHEX. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.